Hey guys, in this video we're going to be using ReactJS and the Twitch API to make this dashboard showing the most popular games, the most popular live streams based on viewer count, and also the top live streams based on specific games. So by the end of this video, you're going to have a nice little base for a portfolio project. I'm going to leave some features available for you to build yourself, and that way you can really make it custom. So it's not just another generic project, and you can have something to show on your website or if you're applying for jobs for a portfolio. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to need to do is have a Node.js environment set up. So if you have that locally, you can just use create React app or whatever you want to work with. But for me, I'm just going to use codesandbox. And anybody else, it's probably the easiest way to just get started off with ReactJS or any front-end project. So that's what we're going to be doing for this project. And then you're also going to need a Twitch developer API key. So if you just go to dev.twitch.tv and sign up and log in, you're then going to want to go to your applications and you're going to want to click register an application. And what you want to do is just select either a website or application integration, and you're also going to do a name. Just use anything as long as it doesn't match another one. And for the redirect URL, you can just do http://localhost, so that you can, since we're not going to be setting this up on a domain or anything, you can just put that in there and you won't have any issues. And then you're just going to click create. You might have to set up two-factor authentication on your account. So if it's giving you an error and up here, if an error pops up, you might have to go into your settings and set up that two-factor text authentication. Once we've got that done, what we're going to do is add our dependencies. So if you click here, you can just type it in. We're going to want Axios for making API calls. We're also going to want, let's see, Bootstrap for styling our app. And if you're using your own local environment, you can always just npm install this stuff. But for codesandbox, we can just use it through the user interface. So Bootstrap, Axios, React router, and then we're going to use a Bootstrap theme called Shards UI, which will basically, it's like a material design theme. So we want React Router DOM specifically. So grab that, and then shards-UI. And then once we have that, what we're going to want to do is create our API folder and our components folder. So for our API, what we're going to need is to create this folder and just api.js. And what we're going to do here is import Axios from Axios. And here we're just going to do, we'll call it let API equal Axios.create. And what this is going to be is an object. And this is going to allow us, if you go into your Twitch developers console, what we're going to want to grab if you go to manage is this client ID, and we're going to need this to make API calls, authenticate our API calls. So inside this, whoops, I don't know why. Here we go. What we're going to do is headers, and then inside that, we're going to want to do capital C client dash ID, and then for the value, just paste in that client ID. And then we're going to want to export default API. And what this allows us to do is we can now, wherever we need to make API calls in our app, we can just import this API and use it just like we normally would use Axios, but we don't have to constantly add in this header. So we're going to save that. And then next we're going to create a folder, and we're just going to call it components. And then inside this folder, we're going to create a couple different files. So first we're going to want our header, which will show up with our links on every one of our routes. And then we're going to want streams.js, which will be all of our live stream pages. And I want games.js, which will be the top games by popularity. And then for our last one, we'll call it game streams.js, and that'll just be all the streams for a specific game. The next thing we're going to do is just set up our routing. So to do that, we're going to make these components so they return a very simple value just to make sure that our routing works properly before we start messing around with API calls and stuff like that. So we're going to import React from React, and inside this we're just going to do function game streams, and then we're just going to do return, and let's return a div with some text. And we're just going to do game streams component, and then we can save, and we also need to export that. So export default game streams, and what we're going to do is just copy and paste that to these other components for now. So we'll just do game component, change this to games, save that, and then the streams component. And once we have this, we can go into our main app, and we're going to set up our routing. So open up index, and we're just going to go below this. Actually, first we need to import our browser router. So import, and then from react router dom, where I want browser router as just our router, and then also route as well. So now we want to use this router component to wrap this entire app. So just come down, router, and then cut and paste this so that it's not like that. And we can see everything's back to working again. And now we can basically create our routes and our links. So first we're just going to test a single route to show you how this all works. We're going to do exact path equals just a slash. And what this is basically going to do is for our home page, whenever this route on our home URL is, that's where the user's at, it will then render this component. And what we're going to select is our game component that we just made. So we're going to do games, and then we're going to import this up here. So import games from /components/games. And we're also going to bring in link just to show you how this works. So link, I'll use this here. We're going to link to, actually we don't even need to bring that in for the moment. You can see now that we're getting this game component right here because we're on this home page. So basically, as you can see, kind of the way to think how React Router works is that anything outside this route will always show up. So no matter what, if we left it like this, no matter what URL we go to, this is always going to be here. If we changed this link to something else, like if we change this to our game streams, that would render instead. So a good way to think of this is we're going to get rid of this and replace this with our header, because we always want those, if we go to our finished, we always want these links at the top to show. So we're going to put our header where this code would be. So that's what we're going to do next. So let's get rid of this stuff here. And also we need to import our Bootstrap style so that our nav bar displays correctly. So I'm just going to paste that in and save. and you can see the text changed a little bit because we imported these styles. So let's open up our header, and we're just going to paste this in stuff right here, and we're also going to want to grab our link from our React router. So import link from React router DOM. Here we go. And we're just going to create a function header, and inside that we're going to return. I'm just going to paste in this HTML because it's pretty simple. There's no point just watching me type. So basically this will create a simple little nav bar. We can see we got our styles. These are from Bootstrap. And then we just have to export default header. And now you can see instead of a normal href HTML element, we're going to use this link. And then save that, and now we're going to go import this into our app. So import header from components, and then we're just going to bring this to the top of our app. So header, and now we can see we always have these links, but right now we don't have it pointing to anything. So if we click, it won't render again. So you can see if we go to our root URL, we get this game component. If we go to top live streams, right now we don't have a path over here, so we don't get anything. So we're gonna take care of that real quick right now. We'll just do import streams from /components/streams. And then we're going to copy and paste this route. And instead of games, we're going to do streams. And then instead of path, we're going to do, instead of that root URL, we're going to do top streams. And so now when we click on this link, we should go back. What's the problem here? Link to top streams. Oh, this is a mistake I make quite a bit. It's easy to forget. You have to put this / here. So save that, and then now we can see we're getting our stream component. So now basically we have our routing set up. All we have to do now is customize the components themselves. So we're gonna have to go in, do our API calls so that we pull in the proper data, and then once we have that data, all we have to do is basically format it in the HTML. So now, first thing we're gonna do, we'll do our game component first, since that's what our root URL is supposed to show. So let's head over to our games component, and what we're gonna need to bring in now is use state and use effect. So traditionally, if you're working with ReactJS, you'd have to, if you wanted to have state in your component to store data, you'd have to turn this from a function into a class and add a bunch of kind of boilerplate. But a newer feature is called hooks, which allows us to use state inside these functional components. So that's what we're going to use for this tutorial. We're going to do games, and then set games, and we're going to set that equal to use state. And we're going to make our default a empty array. So if you've worked with ReactJS before but not hooks, this is the equivalent of setting up a constructor function with the default of an empty array and having a games key in that state object. So now what we're going to want to do, once we've got that set, is we're basically going to get rid of this, and we're going to start kind of formatting how we want things. So we're just going to create here, we're going to create a h1 tag, and we're going to call this popular games, most popular games. And then underneath this, what we're going to do is create basically a dynamic bunch of cards, which are a Bootstrap thing. So before we can do that, we obviously need our data. So let's go to our Twitch API docs, and the first URL we're going to hit for this is get top games. So we can pull in this URL right here, and basically what that will return is, I think, the top 20 games based on popularity that are currently being live streamed. And then over here we can see the response we'll get is a data array, and inside that we'll get 20 objects that look like this. So it'll give us our box art, the name of the game, and an ID. So if we look kind of to get an idea, visualize this, when we go over here to our finished product, this is where we're going to do our game name, and then this is going to be our box art URL that we're pulling in. And for this link, we're going to use the ID basically to get more data depending on that specific game. So this first API call is pretty simple. All we need is this URL. We're going to paste that, and we're going to import our API. So import API from ... We have to do 2 dots because we have to move up out of this components folder to grab this. So /API. And then inside this is where we're going to use this use effect. So again, use effect is basically the equivalent of using something like component did mount. If you know how to use normal class functions in ReactJS, this is basically the equivalent of component did mount. So we're going to do return a function. So we're going to use an arrow function. And then inside this, we can now fetch our data. So we need an async function for this to work properly. So we're going to do another function here. We're going to call it fetch data. And we're going to set that equal to an async function. And now we can basically pull in we can make this API call. So we're going to do const result equals api.get, and we're going to paste in that URL. And then for now, we're just going to console.log, so you can I think the most important thing, and the thing most newer developers struggle with, is they don't have a good idea. They can't conceptualize in their head like what their data looks like, and thus they can't format it properly. So we're just going to print that result.data, and then we're going to save. If this works properly, we should be able to let's see, why is this not getting pulled in? Oh, I know, because we're not calling it. I just realized. So we have to make sure to now call this little function here. So underneath, outside this, we have to call this now. So we're going to we have to fetch data. And now we can see we're getting undefined, and that's because we didn't do await. I forgot that. And what this little keyword does, this is like a wrapper around a promise. So instead of doing .then and having to handle the response data, we can just do await. So now this is the data we're pulling in from that API, and we can see we're getting exactly what we expected. We were getting just like the URL, just like the documentation shows, we're getting an ID and name of box art, and we're getting 20 of those. So now all we have to do is basically map over this data array inside our state, and we can get exactly this, what we're showing. So instead of console.logging that, we're just going to comment that out. This is where we have to use our state update. So inside this hook, we're just going to do set games, and then basically instead of an empty array in our state, we're going to replace it with this array that we got in our data. So we're just going to set that to result dot data. So now we can go down to our HTML, and we're going to do some brackets because we're going to use JavaScript, and we're going to access that game state. So games, this gives us access to up here. It'd be just like if we did this dot state dot games, and now we can do games dot map because we want to use that array and create elements dynamically based on that. So game, and then for every game in this array, we are going to return a div. So we're going to do div, and here we're going to use our Bootstrap. So we're going to do div class name, and we're going to make this column based. So we're going to do column dash, let's do 4 for now. In a little bit we'll go in and we'll add some more classes so that it's dynamic, because if we look at this, I have it set up so that depending on the size of the screen we have some breakpoints. So if you're on mobile, it'll break down to 1, and if you're on a bigger screen it'll do 4 rows. So we'll also add that in later, but for now we're just going to keep it simple. We also have to wrap this. We have to make sure we wrap this in a row. So we need another div, and this class name is going to be just row. And we have to make sure again. So one of my kind of complaints about codesandbox is they're autocomplete a lot of the times. It's a pain because it'll autocomplete up here and then you have to copy and paste down below. So inside that column now, we're going to create another nested div, and we're going to create a card. So div again, and this is going to be class name equals card, and inside that card we're ready to do I'm just going to paste this so you don't waste time watching me type. So now we may need to make a couple changes here. First off, we need to make sure we import that link. So we're just going to import link from React Router DOM. Whoops. DOM. And what else do we got? We also need to change this from .data. We need to add another data at the bottom here, so that we're actually getting inside our array. And now we can see we're getting the start of our return value. Now the issue here is that we're getting a 404 on these images, and that's because if we look at our documentation, it returns with this value in here and width. We have to replace this with the image size of our choice. So we're going to have to create a little helper function underneath here. So before we return this data, what we're going to want to do is format it. So we're going to do let data array equal results dot data dot data. And then what we're going to want to do is map over this. So we're going to do let final array equal data array dot map. So what we're going to do is dynamically go in here and basically set our image to whatever size we want. So we're going to do we have to make a new image URL. So let new URL equal, and we're going to do game.boxart, because this is the URL, this is what we want, and then we're going to go in and dynamically replace that. So our boxart URL, and then we're going to do dot replace. And our first argument in here is going to be where we want to replace. So we're going to do width, and the second is what we're replacing it with. So we'll just do 300. So this will basically replace it with a return a value of 300 pixels for the width, and then we're going to do it nested. So we're going to do dot replace again, and we're going to replace the height. So same thing, we're going to do height and then 300 pixels. And then basically with that new URL, we're going to reset that value. So underneath that, we're going to do game.boxart URL equals new URL. And now we can see we're pulling in these thumbnails just like we want. The final thing we're going to want to do before this is finished is just create a custom class so that we don't get these ugly blue links. So we're just going to go into our styles.css, and we're going to create a .link class, and we're just going to set the color to white. And now we can see that, but also we have to set the hover, so copy and paste that. Whoops. Copy and paste that and change the hover. And now we can see we basically have an exact match to our initial page. The one thing we're going to need to do now is if we click on this, you can see we get nothing. We have we're getting this as it properly is, but we're not, we don't have a component set up yet, so it's not, if we go back to our index, we can see it doesn't render anything because of that. So that's going to be next up what we're going to do.